My name is Saloni, and my AP research project is on social impact framing. So I'll start off by walking you through how I got to my topic. So of all the social issues that I could have picked, I chose climate change, one because of its prevalence in today's society, and two because there is a distinct disparity between the urgency of this issue and the tangible actions that have been taken to address it. So if we take a look at this quote over here, which is one of the hundreds of statistics that we are seeing now about climate change, it's published by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it says, without significant measures to reduce fossil fuel usage, global temperatures are likely to increase by 34.7 degrees Fahrenheit in the next 10 years. And if you think about that short time frame of 10 years, 35 degrees is a staggering increase. So I wanted to dig a little deeper and see what the world has done so far about statistics like these and what is their response to it. So what I found here is a graph of the US primary energy consumption by energy source. And if we take a look at natural gas experienced an increase from 15% in 1960 to 32% in 2021. Meanwhile, looking at renewable energy, it remained at about 12.1%, which is quite marginal compared to natural gas and its share. And this statistic is also interesting because in 2011, the UN IPCC stated that very little limits the full integration of renewable technologies for satisfying global energy demand. And this was stated 10 years ago, and still in 2021, we're not even close to full integration. So I wanted to understand what exactly is causing this disparity. And upon more research, I found this quote by Mark Jacobson, a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University. And it said that more than technological or economic barriers, the main obstacle to achieving 100% renewable energy is the lack of social and political will. And so the takeaway from this quote is that disparity is people, and perhaps they don't perceive climate change as urgent as it is. And so this might be because messaging and information about climate change is not effective in conveying the true issue and the true threat of this situation. And so when we're looking at messaging and how information is portrayed, a concept that's very important is the framing effect, which is used in psychology, where the context and wording of information influence how people make decisions and perceive information. And so this led me to kind of my starting research question, which is how can the framing effect change perceptions of climate change? And by changing how I word information, can that make people more likely to take action towards climate change? So now that I had that kind of field identified, I delved deeper to develop my gap for my research question. So here I have two sources that were pretty influential in shaping my research question. The first one is a report published by psychological anthropologists at Stanford University. And basically what it says is in 2008, California, which is a pretty liberal state, was able to pass legislation that banned LGBTQ marriage in the state. And this was all because of the framing of the legislation, which was very interesting because it showed that my research, which is along the same lines of framing, has a lot of relevance and can even influence public policy and transcend political alignments. And then when I was looking into past studies conducted on this topic, I found that there were past studies conducted on various frames, and this one over here by Alexis Spence and Nick Pigeon in Cardiff University framed climate change in terms of local and distant consequences. And so this is just one of the many frames. There were ones about framing it as a catastrophic disaster, or one as a public health issue, and then seeing how people respond to that. But one frame that remained relatively unexplored were the positive and negative frames. So the positive frame is where you frame information in terms of the benefits to the person, and negative is where you frame it in terms of the losses. So that's how I was able to come up with my research question: how can the framing effect change public perception of climate change through positive and negative frames. And so now that I had this decided, I began my methodology. So I went with an experimental research method, which was ideal for my question because I wanted to identify a causal relationship between a type of frame and how that influenced individuals' propensity to act on climate change. I used a Google Forms survey and I selected 32 participants through my community network. And since I did have this limitation of I had participants only from who I knew, I tried to diversify my sample as much as possible by selecting people that varied in terms of culture, personality, education, and my age range was 17 to 38 years old. So I tried to select a sample in the millennial generation because I know that these people are more likely and at kind of that prime age to actually take action. Then I did obtain consent, and participants were asked to complete 2 surveys, preliminary and an actual survey, which I'll go into in a little bit. And during this entire process, I did have a mentor guide me. So his name is Patrick Barnwell, and he is a doctoral candidate at Rutgers in social psychology. And he also is coincidentally working on a manuscript along the same lines of my project. So he was actually had the experience and expertise to guide me, and as someone who's not as knowledgeable in psychology and how exactly to conduct a study, he provided that knowledge and guidance. So here I have a consent form. It's an example that I sent out to my participants. All it did was basically inform participants of their rights, like the right to withdraw, and that their confidentiality was guaranteed throughout this process. The next part of my survey is the preliminary survey, which is to gain background information on my participants, and then to also get some context for my analysis. So I asked them questions like, why do they think the Earth's temperature is getting warmer? Do they acknowledge that climate change is occurring? Then the President and Congress dealing with climate change should what? So how high of a priority do they think climate change should be? And then whether they think each individual has a personal responsibility to help fight the climate crisis. And for some questions, I did use a 7-point ordinal Likert scale, which is really useful in analysis because you can calculate the means and standard deviations quite easily, and also it adds more precision to your data. So now for my actual survey. The way that I designed my survey is I constructed 2 statements about climate change, one in the positive frame and one in the negative frame. So for the positive frame, I basically talked about climate change as the greatest opportunity we have, and I detailed the benefits of tackling this crisis, such as how much households would save annually, how many more job opportunities it would create, and the remarkable improvements in public health. For the negative frame, I talked about climate change as the greatest threat, and then I also added these statistics about, again, the negative implications of failing to address climate change, like the additional yearly deaths, the undernourishment, and the disease. And the way that I sent out this survey is I created 2 different surveys. They both had the same content in it, but they differed in the order that the statements were presented, so that way the first statement wouldn't create a bias, and we would try to eliminate as many extraneous variables as possible. And also, before sending out my survey, my mentor advised me to calculate the Flush-Kincaid index, which indicates how challenging a passage is to understand. And again, I wanted to make sure that both statements were equally challenging, and so the technicality would not be something that would deter the reader and affect the results. So after calculating the index, I found that both the positive frame and negative frame statements were for college reading level, and they had similar average words per sentence. So that way, again, another variable, another extraneous variable could be eliminated. So now, in my survey, after reading each statement, participants were asked a series of questions, and they can be grouped into 4 measures. So the first measure is message quality, which is how persuasive they found that message to be. Second is message credibility. The third one is backlash, which is are they critical of the message or of the researchers or the scientists? And then the fourth one is defensive avoidance, which is do they find the message threatening? And that's important because you usually avoid things that you find threatening, so that can provide insight into your true intentions after reading the statement. And so after collecting all my data, I began the analysis portion where I used a free statistical analysis software called JASP, and I performed 2 tests, a paired samples t-test to determine if there's a statistical difference between the positive frame and the negative frame, and then I also calculated convex alpha, which is a measure of how interrelated the constructs are within each measure. And these were all guided to me by my advisor because he's someone who has expertise in psychometric analysis. And so for my results, message credibility, I did find that there is a meaningful difference in self-reported message credibility. So what this means is that participants found the positive frame to actually be more credible than the negative frame. And as you can see over here, the mean response for the positive frame was higher than for the negative frame, which does have some significant implications that I'll talk about. But as for the other measures, there was a lack of potential significance for message quality, backlash, and defensive avoidance. And to understand why, I looked at my preliminary survey results, and I found that most of my survey generally cared about climate change. As you can see here, about 80% of them were interested in receiving additional information about the ways of limiting climate change. So generally, there wasn't any backlash against the statements. They generally found both statements equally persuasive, and they weren't going to avoid the statements because they didn't find them threatening at all. So we have to consider these results in context of the limitations of my study. And so the first limitation is that I did oversample on my females. So in my study, about 71% of my participants were females, which actually does tend to occur in psychology studies just because females are more likely to voice their concerns about social issues. Secondly, I did have a limited sample, so I was able to recruit 32 participants, but that is on the lower scale of the number of participants, and having more participants would give me stronger results, and maybe they might have resulted in some potential significance for the other measures. And third, I didn't mention that I calculated convex alpha in my analysis, and what I found there is that my findings may not be as reliable when compared to the standard scales. So given that I didn't have expertise in this, my advisor just told me to mention it as a limitation and have these psychometric properties be further evaluated. So this leads me to my conclusion, where what I found from research by Rutgers University and even Yale is that given that climate change is generally just has a lot of negative implications with it, media tends to also portray it, the information about it, with a negative valence. And so they don't really focus on potential solutions, rather they look at the catastrophic impacts of failing to address the crisis. And this can sometimes overwhelm people and distance them from the actual issue, rather than trying to persuade them to take some action. And so from my research, I found that framing information positively actually is viewed as more credible. And so if media and if researchers look on focusing on the benefits of addressing this issue and looking at potential solutions, they might be able to increase their credibility. And by increasing credibility, they might be able to persuade their readers more about taking personal action towards this. And so this should hopefully also provide a sense of hopefulness about the overall situation, rather than creating a more negative valence about it. And so in terms of future research, if I had more time, I would give a different sample. I would try to recruit a different sample but with the same questions. So this time focusing specifically on people who do not perceive climate change to be an urgent issue, because my sample was more people of the opposite. They generally cared about it. I would also try to recruit an equal ratio of all genders so that I could get all opinions weighed in. And then have a larger sample to increase the reliability of my results and decrease variation. And to do all this, there is, Amazon has a platform called Mechanical Turk where you can crowdsource large populations and have them, if they're interested in doing a task, you can get much more diverse sample. So that would be how I would conduct this research. And that is it. So thank you very much for listening.
My question for you is, how is the method or process you chose aligned with the purpose of your research? Which methods did you consider and reject?
So the method that I chose is an experimental research method. And that method is where I conducted a survey and I wanted to determine a causal relationship between the type of frame and how it affected individuals' propensity to act on climate change. And that was pretty aligned with my overall question, which is how do the negative and positive frames affect propensity? So by going with this method, I was able to determine a relationship. Other methods that I did look at were conducting a content analysis, where I don't actually do my own survey, but I look at past studies. But for me, since there were not many studies actually looking at the positive and negative frames, I found it better to actually conduct my own research on this.
Thank you.
What might be the real-world implications or consequences, like influence on others' behaviors, decision-making, or discoveries related to your findings?
So, as I mentioned in the slide about the conclusions, this information and with my findings, if people go along with my findings and their suggestions and try framing information about climate change positively by looking at the potential solutions of it and the benefits of it, they might be able to see an increase in the number of people that find it urgent and that take action against it. And even in the source that I mentioned in my gap about in 2008, the California legislation, they were able to frame legislation in a certain way to affect public policy. And so my hope is that with this research, it can affect public policy and increase public demand for addressing this issue.
In what specific part of your research was your expert advisor most helpful? What did you learn from your expert advisor about your field of research?
So my advisor was helpful throughout the entire process of my research, but especially during the analysis section, because as someone, as I mentioned, who does not have expertise in psychology, he was able to guide me on what tests to perform to determine significance, and then also how to interpret the results. And when I had the issue where I was uncertain how to interpret the convex alpha, he was able to provide me guidance on that and tell me possible routes that I could go. And one route that he did suggest was looking at my data a little bit more and trying to conduct more tests on it. But since I had limitations in time and resources, I decided to just list it as a limitation. But overall, I learned from this that psychology is an incredibly vast field with a lot of different areas of research, and it all depends on the amount of time that you can put into it. And just through this research project, I was able to learn a lot about psychology, but the more time that you put into it, you can actually have results that have real implications to people, and that can truly have transforming effects.
Any other questions?
I have one more question, but you're within your time. In your literature review, did you run across, there's a newer genre in science fiction and gaming and philosophy called solar punk, which tries to positively frame climate change. Did you run across that at all?
No, I didn't.
Okay, because intuitively, because there's not a lot of research about it, the understanding is that we need a positive framing if we're going to get the kind of engagement we want. And I think that that genre and that philosophy is an attempt to find a positive frame. So it connects a lot with your research.
Yeah.
So thank you. That was very interesting.
I don't have a question, it's more of a general comment, sort of compliment. I think you did an excellent job really in managing the depth of the information. I mean, you didn't have one note card or whatever, and it really speaks to the amount of time and energy that you put into understanding what you're doing.
Thank
So,
you.
good job on that.
Very impressive.
Any questions from the audience at all? Audience? Parents? Any questions?
There's one up there.
No, you just gave a thumbs